Welcome to Life Stories, where we share inspiring tales of resilience, love, and the power of kindness. Today's story takes us on a remarkable journey of transformation, starting with a simple act of compassion on a cold Chicago street. Ryan, a man battling the hardships of homelessness, crosses paths with Grace, whose selfless gesture ignites a chain of events that changes both their lives forever. Through adversity, rediscovery, and hope, they build a legacy that impacts countless others. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's heartfelt tale and explore how one small act can truly change the world. The cold wind of a late November morning swept down Michigan Avenue in Chicago, weaving through bustling crowds, busy shops, and glistening high-rise buildings. Among the sea of people moving with purpose, Ryan sat on the sidewalk, invisible to all who passed him by. His once vivid blue eyes, now dulled by hunger and exhaustion, stared ahead, unfocused. At just 28 years old, life had worn him down. His unkempt hair fell in uneven strands over his face, and the tattered clothes he wore barely shielded him from the icy chill. His ribs, prominent beneath his torn shirt, betrayed the weeks he'd gone with little more than scraps to eat. Ryan wasn't always like this. There was a time, long ago, when he had dreams, when his eyes lit up with hope and his laughter was infectious. But the world wasn't kind to dreamers without a safety net. Circumstances he barely had control over had swept him into the gutter, where life became a day-to-day battle for survival. And today, like every other day, survival felt like a distant, cruel joke. As the world rushed around him, Ryan's stomach growled painfully, the emptiness inside him gnawing like a relentless beast. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to stifle the ache. Just one more day, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the noise of the city. Someone will notice. Someone will see me. But even as he tried to believe his own words, a bitter voice inside him scoffed. Who are you kidding, Ryan? No one looks twice at a beggar. The hours crawled by with an unbearable slowness. People rushed past him, clutching steaming cups of coffee and bags of food, their coats wrapped tightly around them as if shielding themselves not only from the cold but also from the sight of people like him. Ryan's pride, the last thing he held on to, kept him from approaching anyone for help. He watched as others in his position ventured forward, asking strangers for spare change or scraps of food. But he couldn't do it. He wouldn't. Not yet. Instead, he sat his eyes darting toward the corner where a hot dog vendor worked, the aroma wafting through the air like a cruel tease. His mouth watered, and his stomach churned. For a brief moment, he considered breaking his vow and searching through the nearby trash cans for anything that might ease the pain. But even in the depths of despair, he held himself back. Not like this, he murmured. Not yet. As the day wore on, Ryan noticed an older man sitting not far from him. The man, with weathered skin and a worn coat, watched Ryan with a mixture of pity and understanding. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse from age and a life of hardship. Kid, sometimes it feels like things will never change. But we survive. That's all we can do. Ryan looked at him, his pride crumbling slightly under the weight of his hunger and despair. I know, he replied, his voice trembling. But surviving isn't enough. We need more. We need food, jobs, a way out of this. It's not just about living. It's about being human again. The older man nodded but said nothing more. Their shared silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken truths of life on the streets. As if by some miracle, at that moment, Ryan's silent plea seemed to be answered. A woman, dressed in a simple but elegant coat, stopped in front of him. Her warm brown eyes softened as they met his. She didn't say a word but handed him a paper bag. The warmth of the bag seeped into Ryan's cold hands, and the scent of freshly baked bread and roasted meat filled his nostrils. He looked up at her, his eyes filling with gratitude and emotion. Thank you. He said, his voice cracking. You have no idea how much this means to me. The woman smiled gently, her expression kind but reserved. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Ryan stared after her for a moment, the bag still clutched in his hands. He opened it carefully, revealing a large sandwich, fresh, warm, and inviting. His stomach growled louder, urging him to devour it. But as his eyes wandered to the two other men sitting nearby, their thin faces and hollow eyes mirrored his own. Without hesitation, he tore the sandwich into 3 parts, offering the others their share. "Hey, guys," he said, his voice hoarse but kind. "Let's share. No one should go hungry if we can help each other." The men stared at him in surprise, then accepted the food with quiet thanks. Ryan watched them eat, his own hunger momentarily forgotten in the warmth of shared humanity. Across the street, Grace stood with her stepmother Vivian. Grace had seen everything, the way Ryan had selflessly divided his meal, the quiet dignity with which he carried himself even in the face of unimaginable hardship. Her heart ached. "He's not like the others," she murmured, almost to herself. Vivian, ever cold and calculating, grabbed Grace's arm, pulling her away. "Don't even think about it," she hissed. "You don't know these people. They're dangerous." "But he's not," Grace protested, her voice trembling with a mixture of indignation and emotion. "You saw what he did. How can we just walk away? He deserves kindness, not judgment." Vivian's grip tightened. "Don't be naive, Grace. People like him don't change. They'll take whatever you give them and squander it. You can't save them." Grace tried to argue, but Vivian's icy determination left no room for discussion. As they walked away, Grace cast one last glance at Ryan. Her heart felt heavy, torn between her compassion and the stifling control of her stepmother. Meanwhile, Ryan finished his share of the sandwich, savoring every bite. For the first time in days, his stomach felt full. But it wasn't just the food that warmed him. It was the act of sharing, the reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, humanity could shine through. He sat back, gazing at the passing crowd with a spark of hope ignited by the kindness of a stranger. Perhaps, he thought, life wasn't entirely devoid of compassion. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to find his way back to the life he'd lost. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the city, Ryan whispered to himself, "One day, I'll do more than survive. I'll live. I'll make something of this life." Little did he know, the wheels of fate had already begun to turn, setting him on a path that would change his life and the lives of those around him forever. The warmth of Grace's gesture lingered with Ryan long after she had disappeared into the crowd. Yet across the bustling streets of Chicago, another kind of plan was forming, one rooted not in kindness, but in calculation. Vivian, Grace's stepmother, sat in her opulent living room, her manicured fingers drumming rhythmically on the armrest of a velvet chair. The space around her was immaculate, filled with ornate furnishings and cold perfection. Much like Vivian herself, her sharp grey eyes sparkled with a mixture of disdain and cunning as she recalled the earlier incident with Grace on the street. Vivian had always prided herself on control over her life, her marriage, and especially over Grace. The young woman's relentless compassion and tendency to defy societal expectations were a thorn in her side. Grace's habit of volunteering in shelters, donating without permission, and now, openly engaging with a beggar on the street, it was intolerable. It threatened everything Vivian had worked so hard to cultivate. In her world of polished appearances and calculated social connections, there was no room for Grace's naive sense of justice. Sipping her tea, Vivian turned her thoughts over like pieces of a chess game. Her grip on Grace was slipping, and she needed a way to remind her stepdaughter of her place, not just in their family, but in the rigid hierarchy of society. A cruel smile spread across her lips as an idea began to take shape. The man from the street. The beggar. What was his name? Ryan. Yes. He would do nicely. The plan was audacious. Even by her standards. Vivian relished the challenge. She would force Grace to marry the beggar. The idea wasn't just to humiliate Grace but to deliver a lesson she wouldn't forget, a harsh reminder that compassion had its consequences. And the world didn't reward kindness. If executed properly, this scheme could cement Vivian's dominance over her stepdaughter while making a mockery of the ideals Grace so stubbornly clung to. But how to convince Ryan to go along with it? Vivian's smile deepened as she stood and called for her assistant. Within hours, she had her driver take her to Michigan Avenue. As her car rolled to a stop near the park, Vivian scanned the area until she spotted him, Ryan, still sitting on the sidewalk. His head tilted back against the wall as if he were trying to rest but couldn't. He looked even more disheveled up close. But there was something about his posture, his expression, that intrigued her. Despite his circumstances, he carried himself with a quiet dignity. Vivian stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement as she approached him. Ryan opened his eyes at the sound, startled by the sight of this elegant, statuesque woman standing over him. "You're Ryan, aren't you?" she asked, her tone clipped but measured. He frowned, unsure of how to respond. "Yes, I'm Ryan. Who's asking?" "Vivian," she said smoothly. "Grace's stepmother. You may remember her, she was the young woman who gave you that sandwich earlier today." Ryan nodded, his guard instantly up. "I remember. What about her?" Vivian gave him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I have a proposition for you. One that could change your life. Completely." Ryan blinked, skeptical. He had heard promises before, sweet words that led nowhere. "What kind of proposition?" Vivian stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I want you to marry Grace. In exchange, I will give you a substantial sum of money, enough to ensure you never go hungry again. Enough to give you a home, clothes, and a chance to rebuild your life." The words hit Ryan like a shockwave. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard her. "You want me to marry her? Grace, your stepdaughter?" His tone was incredulous, almost laughing. "That's correct." Vivian replied calmly. "It will be a business arrangement. Nothing more. You'll have everything you could possibly need. In return, you'll stay out of her way and follow my instructions." Ryan's mouth opened and closed, searching for a response. "But why? Why would you want me to marry her?" Vivian's expression hardened, a flash of contempt crossing her face. "Let's just say I need her to understand certain realities. She's too soft-hearted, too willing to throw herself at people like you. Marrying you will be a lesson in what happens when compassion blinds you to the harshness of life." Ryan's stomach churned at her words. He wanted to walk away, to reject her outright. But then Vivian's next words froze him in place. "Think about it, Ryan. How much could you do for others if you weren't starving on the streets? How many lives could you change with the money I'm offering you? This isn't just about you, it's about everyone like you." The thought gave him pause. Ryan's mind flashed to the faces of the two men he'd shared his sandwich with earlier, to the others who huddled in alleys and shelters. He had always dreamed of making a difference, of helping people escape the same misery he'd endured. Could this be his chance? But then there was Grace. She had been kind to him, a bright light in a dark world. The thought of using her, of being part of a cruel game, made him sick. "I don't know if I can do this," he murmured, his voice strained. Vivian's tone softened, but it was no less manipulative. "You can, Ryan. You must. This isn't about love or romance, it's about survival. You'll have a chance to better your life and others. And Grace, she'll adapt. She always does." Ryan looked down at his hands, calloused and trembling. Could he betray the kindness Grace had shown him? Could he sacrifice his principles for the chance to make a difference? "I need time to think," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course. Vivian said smoothly, already confident she had one. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come often. She turned and walked back to her car, leaving Ryan alone with his thoughts. As her car disappeared into the Chicago skyline, Ryan sat in silence, wrestling with the impossible choice before him. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would test everything he believed about himself, about love, and about the power of redemption. Ryan spent the next few days in a haze of uncertainty, pacing the cold streets of Chicago with Vivian's words echoing in his mind. The thought of money, enough to not only rebuild his own life but also help others, was like a flame, warming him in the bitter chill of his reality. Yet every time he considered saying yes, Grace's face came to mind. He remembered her soft smile, her quiet kindness, and how she had looked at him as though he were more than just a man sitting in rags on a sidewalk. The idea of being part of a scheme to humiliate her filled him with guilt. His decision was made harder by the hunger clawing at his stomach and the cold that seeped into his bones at night. The winter winds were unrelenting, and shelters were overcrowded. As much as he hated it, Ryan knew Vivian was right about one thing: this opportunity could change his life. But at what cost? One afternoon, while Ryan sat near a park bench trying to gather his thoughts, an elderly man approached him. The man was thin, with a slight stoop and a cane that clicked softly against the pavement. His grey eyes were sharp, scanning Ryan's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Excuse me, young man," the stranger said, his voice trembling slightly. "May I sit here?" Ryan nodded, shifting over to make room. The man lowered himself onto the bench with a groan, leaning his cane beside him. For a while, they sat in silence, watching the world pass by. Ryan expected the man to leave after a few moments. But instead, he spoke. "You look familiar," the man said, his tone thoughtful. "I can't quite place it. But there's something about you." Ryan frowned, unsure of how to respond. "I don't think we've met." The man studied him for a moment longer, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "Perhaps not. Still, there's something I can't ignore." He hesitated, then added, "Tell me, son, what's your name?" "Ryan," he replied cautiously. "Ryan Callahan." The man's brow furrowed. "Callahan, you say? And your parents? Where are they?" Ryan stiffened, a familiar ache rising in his chest. "I don't know. I never knew my father. And my mother, she died when I was young. I grew up in foster care." The words came out flat, rehearsed from years of telling the same story. The man's expression changed, his sharp eyes softening with something that looked like sorrow or recognition. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "And you don't know anything about your father?" "Nothing at all." Ryan shook his head. "Nothing. Why does it matter?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photograph. He handed it to Ryan, who took it reluctantly. The picture was old and faded, showing a man with kind eyes and a little boy sitting on his lap. The boy couldn't have been older than 3 or 4, his chubby hands clutching a toy train. Something about the image sent a jolt through Ryan's chest, though he couldn't say why. "That boy," the man said quietly, "is Hudson Harrison. He was my nephew. And I believe you might be him." Ryan stared at the photograph, his heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" The man took a deep breath. "Hudson was my brother Michael's son. Michael married a woman named Vivian after Hudson's mother passed away. For a while, everything seemed fine. But then, one day, Hudson disappeared. Vivian claimed he'd wandered off and gotten lost. But," the man's voice faltered, "something never felt right. I searched for years. But I never found him." Ryan felt the ground shift beneath him. "You think I'm this Hudson?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "I do," the man said firmly. "You have the same birthmark. Look at your wrist." Ryan instinctively turned his wrist over. There it was, a faint, crescent-shaped mark he had noticed many times but never thought much of. He looked back at the man, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. This doesn't make sense. Why would she? Because of money, the man said bitterly. After Michael's death, Hudson was the only heir to his fortune. But if Hudson was gone, everything went to Vivian. She had everything to gain by making sure the boy disappeared. Ryan shook his head, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss the story as impossible. But the more he thought about it, the more pieces began to click into place. His vague, fragmented memories of being taken from a grand house. The brooch Vivian always wore, a design of intertwined roses and vines that had lingered in his subconscious for years. He'd seen it before. He was sure of it now. If this is true, Ryan said slowly, why wouldn't she recognize me when she saw me on the street? The man's expression darkened. Because you've changed. Time and hardship have a way of altering a person's appearance. She probably never expected you to survive, let alone cross paths with her again. But now, he placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. Now, you have a chance to reclaim what's yours. Ryan stared at the photograph again, his emotions swirling: anger, disbelief, and a growing sense of purpose. If what this man said was true, then Vivian hadn't just wronged him, she had stolen his entire life. And now, she was trying to use him in another one of her twisted schemes. I need proof, Ryan said finally, his voice steady. I need to know for sure. The man nodded. We can arrange for a DNA test. It won't take long. But in the meantime, be careful. Vivian is dangerous. She won't let her secrets come to light without a fight. As the man rose to leave, Ryan sat frozen, clutching the photograph. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something he thought he'd lost: identity. He wasn't just Ryan Callahan, a man forgotten by the world. He was Hudson Harrison, a son, an heir, and a victim of a betrayal so deep it defied comprehension. And now, he was determined to uncover the truth and make Vivian pay for what she had done. The revelation about his identity consumed Ryan in the days that followed. If he truly was Hudson Harrison, everything in his life had been a lie: his abandonment, his struggles, his anonymity. But it wasn't just about him anymore. Vivian's betrayal stretched beyond him to the legacy of his father, Michael Harrison, and the family fortune she had stolen. Ryan couldn't allow her to get away with it. The DNA test was underway. The elderly man, Richard Harrison, having arranged everything discreetly. While waiting for the results, Ryan knew he needed to face Vivian and confront the twisted game she was playing. If she recognized him, he might be able to force her hand before the truth came to light. If not, he would reveal it on his terms, ensuring she could no longer manipulate anyone else, especially Grace. Vivian, meanwhile, was preparing for the wedding she had engineered. Believing she was still in control, her demeanor around Grace had shifted. Laced with an unnerving calm, Grace, sensitive to the change, couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Why had Vivian insisted so strongly on this marriage? Why had she brought Ryan into their lives? Grace's every attempt to reason with her stepmother was met with deflection and cold smiles. The day of the wedding arrived, and the Harrison estate, an imposing mansion on the outskirts of Chicago, was alive with activity. Guests in elegant attire spilled into the grand hall, whispering about the scandalous nature of the union. It was no secret that Ryan had been plucked from the streets, and while Vivian had spun the arrangement as an act of charity, the true motive was clear to anyone with a keen eye: humiliation. Grace's act of kindness had become a weapon turned against her, a cruel lesson in Vivian's warped morality. Ryan stood in one of the mansion's opulent rooms, staring at his reflection in a full-length mirror. He barely recognized himself. The sharp suit, the freshly shaved face, it all felt foreign, as though he were wearing someone else's life. But the weight of his mission kept him steady. Today wasn't about appearances or even the wedding itself. Today was about justice. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. It was Grace. She stepped into the room cautiously, her white dress trailing softly behind her. Her face, framed by loose curls, was a mixture of sadness and quiet determination. "Ryan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to talk to you before all this happens." He turned to her, surprised by her presence. "Grace, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be with your family?" She shook her head. "You know as well as I do that this isn't a real wedding. Vivian's forcing both of us into this for reasons I can't even begin to understand." Her eyes searched his face, pleading for honesty. "Why are you going along with this? You don't seem like the kind of man who would agree to something like this without a reason." Ryan hesitated. He couldn't tell her everything, not yet, but he owed her some truth. "I didn't have a choice," he admitted. "Vivian made me an offer. She said I could help others. People like me. If I agreed to this. I thought maybe it was worth it. But now I know there's more to it." Grace frowned, confusion clouding her features. "What do you mean?" Ryan sighed, running a hand through his freshly combed hair. "I can't explain it all right now. But there's something you need to know. Vivian isn't who you think she is. She's hiding things, terrible things, and I'm going to expose her." Grace's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she clutched the folds of her dress. "Vivian, she's always been controlling. But hiding things? What are you talking about?" Ryan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Trust me, Grace. I'll explain everything soon. Just believe me when I say I'm not your enemy. I'll make this right." She stared at him for a long moment. And then, to his surprise, she nodded. "I believe you," she said softly. "I don't know why, but I do." Before either of them could say more, a sharp knock interrupted them. It was one of Vivian's assistants, summoning them to the ceremony. Grace cast one last look at Ryan before leaving the room, her expression a mix of trust and fear. The ceremony began in the mansion's grand ballroom, adorned with glittering chandeliers and rows of seated guests. Ryan stood at the altar, his heart pounding as Grace walked toward him, her steps hesitant but steady. He could feel Vivian's eyes on him, cold and calculating, from her seat at the front. As the officiant began the ceremony, Ryan's mind raced. He had to pick the right moment, the perfect time to reveal the truth. He had already planned what he would say, how he would expose Vivian's lies. But he needed to wait for the crucial moment. The officiant's voice rang out, "If anyone has any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace." A tense silence filled the room. Ryan's pulse quickened. This was it. But before he could speak, Vivian stood. Her expression was serene, but her voice cut through the air like a blade. "I have something to say," she announced, drawing gasps from the audience. Ryan's blood ran cold as he turned to face her. What was she doing? Could she know what he had discovered? He clenched his fists, his mind racing. Vivian stepped forward, her heels clicking ominously against the polished floor. "Before this union proceeds, I think it's only fair for everyone here to know the truth." Ryan braced himself, his heart pounding. Whatever Vivian was about to reveal, he was ready to face it and to make sure the truth about her finally came to light. Vivian stood at the center of the grand ballroom, a picture of poise and authority. Her sharp grey eyes swept over the stunned audience, her lips curling into a smug smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I feel it is my duty to address the elephant in the room before this union takes place." Ryan stood frozen at the altar, his heart racing. He hadn't expected this turn of events. He had planned to expose Vivian on his own terms, but now she was taking control, and that terrified him. He glanced at Grace, who stood beside him, her face pale and stricken, her hands clutching her bouquet tightly. "You see," Vivian continued, her voice carrying easily across the silent room, "some of you may be wondering why my stepdaughter, Grace, Is marrying a man like Ryan, a man who, until recently, lived on the streets? The whispers began immediately, hushed and urgent. Ryan felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes bearing down on him, judging him, dismissing him. His fists clenched at his sides, anger simmering beneath his carefully maintained exterior. "This is what happens," Vivian said, her tone turning colder, sharper, when someone refuses to understand their place in society. Grace, for all her good intentions, has allowed her naive compassion to cloud her judgment. And now, she must learn the consequences of her actions. "Vivian, stop this," Grace interrupted, her voice trembling but resolute. She took a step forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. "This isn't about me. It's about you and your twisted need to control everyone around you." The audience gasped, and all eyes turned to Grace. Ryan's heart swelled with admiration for her courage. She was standing up to Vivian in a way he hadn't seen before, her usual quiet demeanor replaced by a fiery determination. Vivian's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She quickly regained her composure, her expression turning icy. "Oh, my dear Grace," she said, her voice laced with condescension. "You have no idea what you're talking about. This is for your own good." "No, it's not," Ryan said, stepping forward. His voice was low but steady, cutting through the rising tension in the room. "This is about you, Vivian. It's always been about you." Vivian's eyes snapped to him, narrowing dangerously. "And what exactly do you think you know, Ryan?" she asked, her tone mocking. Ryan took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage he had. The time for silence was over. "I know that you're not just a controlling stepmother trying to teach a lesson," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I know that you're a liar, a manipulator, and a thief." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Vivian's mask of composure slipped, her face tightening with barely contained fury. "How dare you?" she hissed, stepping closer to him. "You know nothing about me." "I know enough," Ryan shot back. "I know who you really are, and I know what you've done." He turned to the audience, his voice ringing out with conviction. "You all deserve to know the truth. My name isn't just Ryan Callahan. It's Hudson Harrison. I'm Michael Harrison's son, the rightful heir to the Harrison estate." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words sinking in. Grace's eyes widened in shock, her bouquet falling from her hands. Vivian's face went pale, her carefully constructed facade finally cracking. "This woman," Ryan continued, pointing at Vivian, "abandoned me when I was a child. She wanted me out of the way so she could claim my father's fortune for herself. She lied to everyone, told them I was gone, and took everything. And now she's trying to use me again to humiliate Grace and tighten her grip on this family. That's ridiculous." Vivian spat, her voice trembling with anger. "You're nothing but a street rat spinning fairy tales. You can't prove any of this." Ryan smiled grimly. "Actually, I can. The DNA test results came in this morning. Richard Harrison arranged everything. The results confirm it. I am Hudson Harrison. And there's more. Richard shared the truth about my father's death, how the circumstances were far more suspicious than anyone realized. You can't hide anymore, Vivian." The audience was stunned into silence, their expressions a mix of shock and disgust as they turned to Vivian. She took a step back, her composure finally unraveling. "This is a lie," she said weakly, her voice losing its usual sharpness. "It's all lies. It's over, Vivian," Ryan said, his tone resolute. "You've spent your life controlling and hurting people. But the truth has caught up to you. You can't manipulate your way out of this." Grace stepped forward, her voice trembling with both emotion and strength. "Is it true, Vivian? Did you really do all this? Did you abandon him?" Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line, her silence speaking volumes. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she turned to Ryan. "I believe you," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her conviction. Ryan nodded, his heart aching at the pain he saw in her eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As the truth settled over the room, Vivian's downfall became inevitable. Guests began whispering among themselves, their once favorable opinions of her crumbling under the weight of Ryan's revelations. Vivian stood alone, her world collapsing around her. For the first time in years, Ryan felt a sense of clarity and purpose. He wasn't just a nameless man struggling to survive. He was Hudson Harrison, and he was ready to reclaim his life. But more than that, he was ready to protect the people he cared about and ensure that Vivian's reign of manipulation and cruelty came to an end. The grand ballroom of the Harrison estate was no longer filled with the hum of polite conversation or the clinking of champagne glasses. Instead, an eerie silence lingered in the air, punctuated only by the faint whispers of the stunned guests. All eyes were fixed on Vivian, her usually impeccable demeanor now unraveling. Her once sharp, calculating gaze darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. Ryan, standing tall at the altar, felt a wave of emotions wash over him: relief, anger, and the faintest glimmer of hope. He had spent years as a forgotten man, stripped of his identity and dignity. But now the truth was finally out. His voice had been heard, and his place in the world restored. Yet, he knew this was only the beginning. Justice had to follow, and he would ensure it did. Vivian broke the silence first, her voice trembling as she addressed the crowd. "You don't honestly believe this nonsense, do you? A DNA test? A story concocted by a man who lived on the streets?" She laughed. "But it was hollow, desperate. This is nothing but a ploy to tarnish my reputation." "His lying." Ryan stepped forward, his expression calm but resolute. "You can't spin your way out of this. Vivian, the DNA test is real. The documents proving my identity are already in the hands of the authorities. And Richard has corroborated everything. Your lies are over." Grace, who had stood in stunned silence, now found her voice. She turned to Vivian, her stepmother, the woman who had controlled her life for years. "You've manipulated me, lied to me, and now I see the truth," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You tried to destroy Ryan's life and mine, all for your own greed and power. How could you?" Vivian's face hardened, the vulnerability of moments earlier replaced by defiance. "You're naive, Grace. Everything I've done was to protect this family, to maintain our reputation. You don't understand how the world works. Kindness, compassion, those things are weaknesses." Grace shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "No, Vivian. They're strengths. They're what make us human. And Ryan has shown more humanity and courage than you ever have." The room erupted into murmurs, the tide of opinion turning sharply against Vivian. Guests who had once admired her now whispered words like monster and fraud. Some stood to leave, their disgust evident in their expressions. Suddenly, Richard Harrison stepped into the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. He held a folder of documents in his hand, which he raised for all to see. "This," he said, his voice steady and clear, "is the evidence that confirms Ryan's identity as Hudson Harrison. It also contains records of Vivian's fraudulent activities over the years. Her reign of deceit ends today." Vivian's face turned ashen, and she stumbled back a step. "You can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "I built this family. I kept it together." "No," Richard said firmly. "You tore it apart. And now, you'll answer for everything you've done." At that moment, a pair of uniformed officers entered the room, their presence drawing gasps from the guests. They approached Vivian, their expressions professional but unyielding. "Vivian Harrison," one of them said, "you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice." The officers moved to handcuff her, but Vivian pulled back, her face twisting in rage. "You can't do this," she screamed, her voice echoing through the ballroom. "You'll regret this. All of you." But her protests were futile. The officers led her away, her cries fading into the distance as she disappeared from view. The room remained silent for a moment, as if everyone was processing what they had just witnessed. Finally, Grace turned to Ryan. Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, "for everything you've been through, for what she did to you." Ryan shook his head, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "You have nothing to apologize for, Grace. You were a victim of her manipulation too. And you were the reason I found the strength to fight back. Your kindness, your compassion, it reminded me of who I was, of what mattered." A small smile broke through Grace's tears. And for the first time in years, Ryan felt a warmth he thought he'd lost forever. In her, he saw not just an ally but a partner, someone who had the same fierce determination to make the world better, no matter the odds. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Vivian's arrest made headlines, her once pristine reputation now in ruins. The authorities began investigating her role in Michael Harrison's death, reopening a case that had been closed too hastily. The public, fascinated by the story of Ryan's rediscovery, rallied behind him, their outrage at Vivian's actions fueling calls for justice. Ryan, however, was focused on the future. With the help of Grace and Richard, he began reclaiming his place in the Harrison family. But he had no intention of living a life of idle luxury. Instead, he and Grace worked tirelessly to establish the Harrison Hope Foundation, dedicated to helping the homeless and vulnerable. The foundation provided shelter, education, and opportunities for those who had been overlooked by society, just as Ryan once had. Grace stood by his side every step of the way, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They married in a quiet, intimate ceremony, surrounded by the people who truly mattered. There was no grandeur, no manipulation, only love, hope, and a shared purpose. As they built their new life together, Ryan often thought back to that cold day on Michigan Avenue when a simple act of kindness had changed everything. Grace's gesture had sparked a chain of events that not only restored his identity but also gave him a new purpose. In the end, it wasn't just justice that had triumphed, it was love, empathy, and the belief that even in the darkest times, humanity could shine through. Together, Ryan and Grace proved that kindness wasn't a weakness but the greatest strength of all. The months after Vivian's arrest were transformative for Ryan, now publicly acknowledged as Hudson Harrison. While the Harrison estate was restored to him legally, the emotional weight of his rediscovered identity was far heavier than he had anticipated. He wasn't just stepping into a life of privilege but also facing the shadows of a past stolen from him. Ryan often found himself wandering through the grand halls of the Harrison mansion, its gilded mirrors and intricate moldings reflecting the life he might have had. Yet, despite the grandeur, he felt out of place, as if the years he had spent on the streets had etched something permanent into his soul. He would pause at portraits of his late father, Michael Harrison, a man he could barely remember but whose face stirred a deep ache within him. Grace became his anchor during those turbulent weeks. She moved into the mansion not as a houseguest but as a partner, her presence filling the cold spaces with warmth. She encouraged him to talk about his experiences, even the painful ones. "You can't move forward until you've made peace with the past," she told him one evening as they sat by the fire in the study. Ryan nodded but hesitated. "It's not just the past," he said quietly. "It's who I am now. I've been Hudson for only a few months, but I was Ryan for years. That life, it shaped me. It's hard to reconcile the two." Grace reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. "Maybe you don't have to choose," she said softly. "You can be both, Hudson, the man who reclaims what was taken, and Ryan, the man who knows what it means to lose everything. Maybe that's your strength." Her words stayed with him. Slowly, he began to embrace both sides of his identity, realizing that his experiences on the streets had given him a unique perspective, one he could use to make a difference. One day, Ryan visited Richard, who had become not just an ally but a paternal figure in his life. The older man, now in better spirits after seeing justice served, welcomed Ryan into his modest home with a smile. "I've been waiting for you," Richard said, gesturing to a chair by the window. "There's something I want to show you." He pulled out a weathered photo album, its pages filled with memories of the Harrison family. Ryan leaned forward as Richard flipped through the photographs, pointing out moments from his childhood, birthdays, holidays, even simple afternoons spent in the garden. "Your father adored you," Richard said, his voice tinged with emotion. "Losing you broke something in him. I wish I could have done more to protect you both." Ryan's throat tightened. "You did more than enough, Richard. You brought the truth to light. Without you, I'd still be lost." As they turned another page, Richard paused. "There's something you should know about your father," he said. "He wasn't just a businessman, he was a philanthropist. He believed in giving back, in lifting others up. He would have wanted you to continue that legacy." Those words resonated deeply with Ryan. He had always felt a pull toward helping others, even when he had nothing to give. Now, with the resources at his disposal, he realized he could honor his father by channeling that instinct into something meaningful. When Ryan shared his thoughts with Grace, her face lit up with excitement. "Let's do it," she said immediately. "Let's create something together, something that gives people hope." And so, the Harrison Hope Foundation was born. The foundation's mission was clear: to provide shelter, education, and opportunities for those in need. Ryan and Grace threw themselves into the work, visiting shelters, speaking with homeless individuals, and understanding the root causes of poverty and displacement. They partnered with local organizations to create programs that offered job training and mental health support, ensuring that their efforts addressed more than just surface-level needs. Ryan's personal story became a cornerstone of the foundation's outreach. He spoke openly about his time on the streets, the challenges he faced, and the kindness that had helped him survive. His vulnerability inspired others, showing them that no matter how dire their circumstances, change was possible. One of the first shelters they opened was named after his father, the Michael Harrison Home. It wasn't just a place for people to sleep, but a space where they could heal and rebuild their lives. Ryan spent countless hours there, talking with residents, sharing meals, and reminding them that they weren't invisible. Grace, too, found her calling in the foundation. She used her connections to rally support, hosting events and securing funding. Her compassion and determination drew others to the cause. And soon, the foundation became a beacon of hope not just for the homeless but for the community as a whole. As the months turned into a year, Ryan and Grace's bond deepened. They worked side by side, their shared mission bringing them closer than ever. They laughed together, cried together, and celebrated every victory, no matter how small. On the anniversary of the foundation's opening, Ryan stood on the porch of the Michael Harrison home, looking out at the crowd gathered for the event. Grace stood beside him, her hand in his. He smiled, his heart full. "I never thought I'd be here," he said quietly. "Not just here in this place, but here in this life." Grace squeezed his hand. "You deserve it," she said simply. "And so do the people we're helping. This is just the beginning." As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Ryan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had reclaimed his identity, confronted his past, and found a purpose that gave his life meaning. But most of all, he had discovered the power of love, kindness, and resilience, forces strong enough to overcome even the darkest of trials. And with Grace by his side, he knew the future held endless possibilities. Together, they would continue to build a world where no one was forgotten, and everyone had a chance to rise. The Harrison Hope Foundation quickly became a symbol of transformation and resilience in Chicago. What began as a simple dream grew into a movement that touched countless lives. Ryan, now fully embracing his role as Hudson Harrison, worked tirelessly to ensure the foundation's impact went beyond superficial charity. He wanted it to be a force for lasting change. Every morning, Ryan and Grace visited the shelters and programs they had established. These visits were more than just appearances, they were opportunities to connect with the people they served. Ryan insisted on sitting down with the residents, listening to their stories, and learning about their struggles and dreams. Each conversation reminded him of his time on the streets and reinforced his commitment to making a difference. One afternoon, while visiting the Michael Harrison home, Ryan met a young man named Jamal. He was in his early 20s, with a guarded expression and a quiet demeanor that reminded Ryan of himself not long ago. Jamal had been living on the streets since he was a teenager, forced to fend for himself after losing his family to tragedy. Ryan sat down next to Jamal in the shelter's common room, offering him a cup of coffee. "Hey," Ryan said, his tone warm and approachable. "How are you holding up?" Jamal shrugged, avoiding Ryan's gaze. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Just trying to get by." Ryan nodded, recognizing the walls Jamal had built to protect himself. "I get it," he said gently. "It's not easy, is it? Feeling like the world's forgotten about you." Jamal glanced at him, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "You don't know what it's like," he said skeptically. "You're rich. You've probably had everything handed to you." Ryan smiled faintly. "That's not exactly true," he replied. "I used to be where you are now, living on the streets, wondering if I'd ever make it out. It wasn't easy, but someone showed me kindness when I needed it most. And it changed everything." Jamal's expression softened, and he leaned in slightly. "What happened?" Ryan shared his story, from his time as a homeless man named Ryan Callahan to the discovery of his true identity as Hudson Harrison. He spoke about the struggles he faced, the people who helped him, and the determination it took to reclaim his life. "You're kidding," Jamal said when Ryan finished. "That's crazy." "It is," Ryan admitted, his smile widening. "But it's real. And it's proof that no matter how bad things get, there's always a way forward. You just need someone to believe in you and to believe in yourself." For the first time, Jamal smiled. It was small and hesitant, but it was there. "Maybe," he said quietly, as Ryan stood to leave. He placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "And we're here to help you figure it out." Moments like these fueled Ryan's resolve. He knew that real change didn't come from grand gestures or massive donations, it came from personal connections, from showing people that they mattered. Grace felt the same way, and together, they poured their hearts into the foundation's work. One of their most ambitious projects was the creation of transitional housing for families displaced by economic hardship. The Harrison Haven, as it was called, offered more than just a roof over people's heads. It provided counseling, job training, childcare, and financial literacy programs, giving families the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. Grace spearheaded the project, using her background in social work and her natural empathy to guide its development. She spent hours meeting with architects, social workers, and community leaders, ensuring every detail was tailored to the needs of the residents. "These families deserve more than just a place to stay," she told Ryan one evening as they reviewed the project plans. "They deserve a future. And that's exactly what we're giving them," Ryan said, his pride in her evident. "You've poured so much into this, Grace. It's going to change lives." When the Harrison Haven opened its doors, the community response was overwhelming. Families who had spent months in shelters or on the streets finally had a safe, stable place to call home. The gratitude on their faces was all the reward Ryan and Grace needed. But their work didn't stop there. The foundation expanded its reach, partnering with schools to create mentorship programs for at-risk youth. Ryan and Grace both participated as mentors, sharing their experiences and encouraging young people to pursue their dreams. Ryan's journey from the streets to the boardroom became a story of hope that resonated far beyond Chicago. Media outlets picked up on the foundation's success, and Ryan was invited to speak at events across the country. At every opportunity, he emphasized the power of kindness and the importance of lifting others up. "None of this would have been possible without Grace," he often said, his voice filled with emotion. "Her compassion saved me when I didn't think I was worth saving. She reminded me that even in the darkest times, humanity can shine through. That's what we're trying to do now, shine a light for others." As the foundation grew, so did Ryan and Grace's love for each other. Their shared mission brought them closer, strengthening the bond that had formed during the most challenging moments of their lives. They celebrated their victories together and leaned on each other during setbacks, always reminding one another why they had started this journey. On their second wedding anniversary, Ryan surprised Grace with a private dinner at the Michael Harrison home. They dined in the shelter's garden, surrounded by flowers and the soft hum of laughter from the residents inside. "I wanted to celebrate here," Ryan said, taking her hand, "because this is where it all began. Not just for me, but for us. Your kindness that day on the street, it changed everything. And I'll never stop being grateful for you." Grace smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "And I'll never stop being proud of you," she said. "Together, we've built something beautiful." As they sat beneath the stars, the laughter of the residents blending with the gentle rustling of leaves, Ryan and Grace knew they had found not just their purpose but also their home in each other and in the lives they touched. Their journey was far from over, but they faced the future with hope, knowing that their legacy would be one of love, empathy, and the unshakable belief in the power of kindness to change the world. As the Harrison Hope Foundation gained recognition, its influence began to extend beyond Chicago. Ryan and Grace's work sparked conversations about the systemic causes of homelessness and poverty, inspiring communities and organizations across the country to rethink how they approached these issues. The Foundation's programs became a model for others. Cities as far as New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta reached out to collaborate, eager to replicate the success of the Michael Harrison home and the Harrison Haven. Ryan and Grace traveled to these cities, speaking with local leaders and visiting struggling communities to better understand their needs. One afternoon, during a visit to a struggling neighborhood in Detroit, Ryan and Grace sat in a community center surrounded by young people eager to share their stories. One girl, barely 16, spoke about her family's struggles to keep a roof over their heads. Her voice shook with vulnerability, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes as she spoke of her dreams of becoming a teacher. Ryan leaned forward, listening intently. When she finished, he smiled warmly. "You remind me of someone," he said. "Someone who showed me that dreams don't have to stay dreams. You're brave for sharing your story, and I want you to know, if you believe in yourself, and if you let others help you along the way, you can do anything." The girl's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "No one's ever said that to me before." Moments like these reminded Ryan and Grace why they had chosen this path. It wasn't just about providing food, shelter, or financial support, it was about restoring dignity and hope. Every life they touched, every story they heard, fueled their mission. Back in Chicago, the foundation continued to expand its reach. Ryan and Grace launched a scholarship program for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, naming it after Richard Harrison to honor his unwavering belief in justice and truth. The scholarships covered not just tuition but also living expenses, ensuring that recipients could focus entirely on their education. The first scholarship recipient, a young man named Carlos, became a symbol of the program's success. Carlos had grown up in foster care, often moving from one home to another, never feeling like he truly belonged. Through the foundation, he not only found financial support but also a mentor in Ryan, who saw echoes of his own journey in Carlos's struggles. Carlos thrived under the program, eventually enrolling at Northwestern University to study social work. At his graduation, he invited Ryan and Grace to celebrate with him. Standing on the stage, Carlos held his diploma high, his voice breaking with emotion as he addressed the crowd. "This foundation didn't just give me an education," he said. "It gave me a family. It gave me hope when I had none. And now, I want to spend my life giving that same hope to others." The audience erupted into applause, and Ryan felt a lump rise in his throat. He turned to Grace, who was wiping away tears, and whispered, "This is why we do this." The foundation's impact wasn't limited to individuals. Corporations and wealthy benefactors began to take notice, many inspired by Ryan's story of resilience and Grace's unwavering compassion. Donations poured in, allowing the foundation to expand even further. New shelters were built, more scholarships awarded, and additional programs launched, each designed to address the root causes of poverty and homelessness. But with success came challenges. Critics emerged, questioning the foundation's methods or accusing it of being overly ambitious. Ryan faced harsh scrutiny from those who doubted his ability to lead such a massive initiative, citing his background on the streets. Grace, too, faced pressure, particularly from those who believed she was naive to devote so much of her time and energy to the cause. Through it all, Ryan and Grace remained steadfast. They leaned on each other, drawing strength from their shared purpose. When doubts crept in, they reminded themselves of the lives they had already changed, the people who now had a second chance because of their efforts. One evening, as they walked through the Michael Harrison home after hours, Ryan paused in the empty dining hall. The room was quiet now, but during the day, it was filled with laughter and conversation, a sanctuary for those who had once felt invisible. "I used to sit on the sidewalk and wonder if anyone would ever notice me," Ryan said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. "Now, we've created a place where no one has to feel that way again." Grace slipped her hand into his, her smile soft and full of pride. "You've done more than that, Ryan. You've shown people that they matter, that they're not forgotten." He turned to her, his eyes filled with emotion. "We've done this," he corrected gently, "together." Their bond grew even deeper in the face of their shared challenges. They found solace in each other, celebrating victories and comforting one another during setbacks. Their love, forged in adversity, became a source of strength that carried them through even the hardest days. As the foundation's influence continued to grow, Ryan and Grace began to focus on long-term change. They partnered with policymakers to advocate for affordable housing initiatives and increased funding for mental health services. They spoke at schools and universities, encouraging young people to get involved in their communities. Ryan's message resonated far and wide: kindness isn't a luxury, it's a responsibility. It has the power to transform lives, not just the lives of those we help, but our own. I'm living proof of that. The ripple effect of their work spread across the country, inspiring countless others to take action. And though Ryan and Grace knew there was still much to do, they faced the future with hope, knowing that their legacy would be one of compassion, courage, and unwavering belief in the power of humanity to rise above even the darkest circumstances. The years rolled on, and the Harrison Hope Foundation blossomed into a beacon of compassion and change, not just in Chicago but across the nation. The organization became synonymous with opportunity and second chances, standing as a testament to the power of kindness and resilience. For Ryan and Grace, the work never ceased to be personal. Every new shelter built, every program launched, carried the echoes of Ryan's journey from the streets to rediscovering himself as Hudson Harrison. And every life touched reminded Grace of why she had stopped that day to offer a sandwich to a man most would have ignored. Their shared history bound them together as they continued to rewrite not only their own futures but also those of countless others. One day, as they walked through a construction site for a new transitional housing project on Chicago's South Side, Ryan paused to take in the scene. The skeletal framework of what would soon become a safe haven for families stood against the skyline, a symbol of hope in a neighborhood that had seen its share of hardship. He turned to Grace, who was reviewing blueprints with the project manager. "Look at this," Ryan said, his voice filled with awe. "We're building more than walls and roofs. We're building futures." Grace glanced up and smiled, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over her face. "We are," she agreed. "But none of this would exist without your vision. Ryan, you've turned pain into purpose. That's no small thing." Ryan shook his head, a quiet laugh escaping him. "You're giving me too much credit. If you hadn't stopped that day, if you hadn't believed in me." She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Ryan, don't ever forget you're the one who chose to keep going. You're the one who took a chance on yourself and on the people around you. I just gave you a nudge." He looked at her, his expression softening. "You gave me a lot more than that, Grace. You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me that I wasn't invisible." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of children laughing. A group of kids from the neighborhood had gathered nearby, watching the construction with wide eyes and boundless curiosity. Ryan and Grace exchanged a look, then walked over to introduce themselves. One little boy, no older than 8, tugged on Ryan's sleeve. "Mister," he asked shyly, "is this place for us?" Ryan crouched down to meet his gaze. "It's for everyone who needs a safe place to stay," he said warmly. "And I bet you'll make it feel like home." The boy grinned, his face lighting up with hope. Grace crouched beside Ryan, her voice gentle. "What's your name?" "Tyler," he said, fidgeting with his jacket. "My mom says we're gonna have to move again soon." "I don't like moving." Ryan's chest tightened. He knew that feeling all too well, the uncertainty, the fear of never finding a place to belong. He placed a comforting hand on Tyler's shoulder. "You won't have to move forever, Tyler," he said firmly. "We're working to make sure you and your mom have a home where you can stay as long as you need." Tyler nodded, his smile returning. "Thanks, mister," he said, before running off to join his friends. Grace stood, watching the children play. "That's why we're doing this," she said softly. "So kids like Tyler can grow up knowing they're safe. That they matter." Ryan nodded, his resolve deepening. "We'll keep building, Grace. No matter how long it takes. We'll make sure no one is left behind." Their commitment to the cause only grew stronger with time. As the foundation expanded, they brought on a dedicated team of staff and volunteers who shared their passion for creating a more compassionate world. Together, they tackled issues from affordable housing to job training to mental health support, always looking for ways to address the root causes of poverty and homelessness. But Ryan and Grace also made time for each other, ensuring that their relationship remained a priority. On weekends, they would escape the bustle of their work and head to a cabin on the outskirts of the city, where they could reconnect and recharge. They spent hours hiking through the woods, cooking meals together, and dreaming about the future. One evening, as they sat by a crackling fire, Grace leaned her head on Ryan's shoulder. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if things had been different?" she asked. Ryan considered the question, staring into the flames. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I wonder what it would have been like to grow up as Hudson Harrison, with my father and everything he built. But then I think about everything I've learned, the people I've met, the lives we've touched, and I realize I wouldn't trade it for anything." Grace smiled, lifting her head to look at him. "You're an incredible man, Ryan," she said. "Or Hudson. Or both. Whatever you want to call yourself. You've made something beautiful out of so much pain. And I couldn't have done it without you," he replied, his voice full of gratitude. Their love, forged in the crucible of adversity, was the foundation upon which they built their shared dreams. They had faced challenges that would have broken many, but together, they had turned those challenges into opportunities to create a better world. As the firelight flickered across their faces, Ryan took Grace's hand. "This is just the beginning," he said. There's so much more we can do. So many more lives we can change. Grace nodded, her eyes shining. And we'll do it together. The future stretched out before them, filled with promise and possibility. They knew there would be more obstacles to overcome, more battles to fight. But they also knew that, together, they could face anything. Their journey wasn't just about redemption or justice anymore. It was about building a legacy of love, kindness, and hope that would continue to inspire long after they were gone. In the years that followed, Ryan and Grace's work continued to transform lives and inspire countless others. Their journey, which began with a simple act of kindness on a cold Chicago street, became a testament to the power of compassion, resilience, and hope. Together, they proved that even in the darkest times, humanity's light could shine through. The Harrison Hope Foundation grew into a movement, with shelters, programs, and partnerships across the country, giving people the tools and support they needed to rebuild their lives. Ryan and Grace remained at the heart of it all, reminding everyone they met that no one is invisible, and no one is beyond saving. As they stood on the porch of the Michael Harrison home one quiet evening, watching the sun set over the city, Ryan turned to Grace with a smile. "We've come a long way," he said. "And we're just getting started." Grace replied, her hand in his. Their legacy, rooted in love and empathy, became a symbol of what's possible when people choose kindness. And so, their story serves as a reminder: one small act can change a life. And one life can change the world. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of courage, love, and redemption.